There's a cemetery in southern Illinois where 5 bodies rest beneath unmarked stones. The families who buried them there fought to keep them in that ground. Armed men blocked the road when others tried to move them. That was in 1874. The graves are still unmarked today. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. Tonight, we explore some unsettling stories where appearances concealed something far darker. Take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the axe murders of Saxtown. Now let's begin. Saxtown was never really a town at all. Just a name given to a scattering of farms south of Millstadt, Illinois, where German immigrants had settled in the 1840s. They'd come seeking what so many had sought: land, independence, a chance to build something lasting. By 1874, these families had done exactly that. They worked adjoining properties. They spoke the same language. They attended the same church at Zion Evangelical. They knew each other's histories, their debts, their grievances. If you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. The landscape was unforgiving. Dense forests had to be cleared. Tree stumps pulled from soil that fought every plow. It was work that required specialized laborers, grubbers they were called. Men strong enough to swing axes for hours, patient enough to dig out roots that reached deep into Illinois clay. This was backbreaking labor in a time before mechanization, before anything but human strength could move earth and wood. Karl Stelsried was among the earliest settlers. Born in Germany around 1809, he'd arrived in St. Clair County in the 1840s and purchased farmland in what would become known as Saxtown. He built a modest log cabin, raised a family, and by 1874, at age 65, he'd become a fixture of the community. His son, Friedrich, known to his neighbors as Fritz, had stayed close. At 36, Fritz worked the family land alongside his father. He'd married Anna, 28 years old, and they had 2 children, Karl, nearly 3, and baby Anna, just 8 months old. The family wasn't wealthy, but they were established. They owned their land. They had livestock, crops, and a reputation for industry. It was an era of economic hardship across America. The Panic of 1873 had triggered a depression that rippled through rural communities. Banks failed. Credit dried up. Farmers who'd borrowed against future harvests found themselves unable to repay debts. In places like Saxtown, where families depended on each other for labor and support, financial strain created tension. Small disagreements became feuds. Unpaid loans festered into resentments that could last for years. Frederick Boltz knew something about resentment. He'd married Anna Stelsried's sister, making him Fritz's brother-in-law. That should have meant closeness, cooperation. Instead, it meant conflict. Boltz had borrowed $200 from the Stelsried family and never repaid it. In 1874, that was substantial money, enough to buy livestock, seed for planting, or tools essential for survival. The debt had sparked arguments. Neighbors heard them. Fritz had made it clear he expected repayment. Boltz had made it equally clear he had no intention of providing it. Then there was John Afkin, tall, powerful, red-haired. He worked as a grubber and general laborer, moving from farm to farm, hiring himself out for jobs that required strength and skill with an axe. He'd worked for the Stelsried family at one time. Something had soured between them. Accounts vary, but the grudge was real. Afkin had a reputation: quick-tempered, mean-spirited. People in Saxtown feared him, kept their distance when they could. He was friends with Frederick Boltz. That friendship would matter later. In mid-March 1874, Fritz Stelsried made a trip to the bank. He collected a package. Accounts suggest it contained an inheritance sent from relatives in Germany. Fritz attended a farm auction on March 16th, carrying with him a large willow basket covered with an oilcloth. He mentioned the inheritance to neighbors. He seemed pleased. The money meant security, perhaps expansion of the farm, a buffer against the ongoing economic troubles. 3 days later, the Stelsried family was dead. The discovery came on the afternoon of March 20th, 1874. Benjamin Schneider, a neighbor, had arranged to collect potato seeds from the elder Carl Stelsried. When he arrived at the property, he noticed the stillness immediately. The farm was quiet in a way that felt wrong. Livestock hadn't been fed. Cows hadn't been milked. No one moved through the yard attending to the morning's work. Schneider approached the cabin. He knocked. No answer. He peered through windows. Nothing stirred inside. He opened the front door and stepped across the threshold. What Schneider found would be documented in newspapers across the nation. The Belleville Advocate would later write that the scene revealed was one that would make the stoutest heart quail. Carl Stelsried lay near his bedroom door in a pool of blood that had spread across the cabin floor. His throat had been cut so deeply he was nearly decapitated. In the adjoining room, Fritz Stelsried was positioned near the doorway between the sleeping quarters, his skull crushed, his throat slashed. 3 of his fingers had been severed, likely during a struggle with whoever had wielded the weapon. His wife Anna and their children, 3-year-old Carl and 8-month-old Anna, had been bludgeoned. The cabin's interior suggested both violence and something more calculated. There had been a fight. Fritz's missing fingers testified to that. But robbery didn't appear to be the primary motive. Later investigations would reveal that drawers and chests, initially reported as ransacked, had largely been left undisturbed. Cash that Fritz had received from selling wheat was still in the home. The inheritance, whatever form it had taken, seemed untouched. Whoever had entered that cabin during the night of March 19th had come with a different purpose. One detail captured investigators' attention immediately. The family dog, a large animal named Monk, was found inside the cabin, lying quietly near the bodies. Monk had a reputation for viciousness toward strangers. He didn't bark at the approach of the killer. He didn't fight. That suggested something crucial. The murderer was someone the dog knew. Someone familiar. Someone the Stelsried family would have opened their door to without suspicion. Word of the murders spread rapidly through Saxtown and the surrounding communities. By the time authorities arrived, nearly 300 people had gathered at the property. The scene was chaotic. Neighbors pressing close, talking in clusters, speculating about who could have done this. The investigation had barely begun, and already the crime scene had been compromised by the sheer number of people moving through it. The bodies were removed to prepare them for burial, a task that fell to women in the community. They washed the remains in the Stelsried barn, which still stood on the property decades later. It was grim work. Several women became ill during the process and had to be relieved by others. The damage inflicted on the family was extensive enough that some of the victims were difficult to identify by appearance alone. On March 22, 1874, more than 1,000 people attended the funeral at Freevogel Cemetery. The gathering wasn't just grief, it was fear. These were people who understood that the killer had likely walked among them, had probably attended the same church services, had worked the same soil. The investigation that followed would transform Saxtown from a close-knit community into a place where neighbors looked at each other with suspicion and dread. The newspapers seized on the story. The New York Times ran it on the front page. Accounts appeared in publications across the country, each one emphasizing the brutality of the crime and the apparent lack of clear motive. This was a massacre that had occurred not in some distant, lawless territory, but in an established farming community during peacetime. It was the kind of crime that suggested something fundamental had broken down, either in the community itself or in the individuals who lived there. For the residents of Saxtown, the reality was simpler and more terrifying. Someone had walked up to the Stelsried cabin on the night of March 19th. Someone had knocked on that door, been recognized, been welcomed inside. And then that same someone had methodically killed 5 people, including an infant, before disappearing back into the darkness of rural Illinois. The question wasn't just who had done it. The question was how they could ever feel safe again, knowing that person was still out there, still walking the same roads, still living among them. Law enforcement in 1874 bore little resemblance to modern police work. There were no fingerprints, no crime scene photographs, no forensic laboratories. The telephone had been invented just 2 years earlier and was not yet in widespread use. Investigators relied on physical evidence they could see and touch, on witness testimony, and on interrogation techniques designed to extract confessions through psychological pressure. In rural Illinois, this often meant a sheriff and his deputies working with limited resources and even more limited training. Deputy Sheriff James Hughes took charge of the investigation. He arrived at the Stelsried property to find the scene already disturbed by the hundreds of onlookers who'd gathered. Still, certain details emerged that would shape the direction of the case. Outside the cabin, investigators found footprints leading away from the property. The earth was soft enough to preserve them clearly. Next to the footprints were drag marks, long grooves in the dirt that suggested someone had pulled an axe along the ground as they walked. The trail led through the woods for more than a mile. Along the way, investigators discovered a pouch of tobacco stained with blood. The footprints and drag marks continued until they reached a specific property, the home of Frederick Bolts. For Deputy Hughes, this was substantial evidence. The physical trail led directly to a man who already had known conflicts with the Stelsried family. Bolts's unpaid debt of $200 provided clear financial motive. Moreover, Bolts stood to benefit from the family's death in another way. If the immediate heirs were eliminated, inheritance laws of the era could potentially allow extended family members, like a brother-in-law married to Anna's sister, to claim the estate. The Stelsried property was reportedly worth several $1,000s at the time, a significant sum during the Depression years. There was also the matter of what had been found inside the cabin. Several sources report that the elder Carl Stelsried was found clutching a handful of bright red hair in his fist. The color was distinctive, not the brown or blonde common among the German families of Saxtown, but a vivid red. John Afkin, Bolts's friend and occasional work partner, was known throughout the community for his full head of red hair. Afkin presented another compelling profile. He'd worked as a grubber, a profession that required exceptional strength and expertise with an axe. The wounds inflicted on the Stelsried family suggested someone with both power and familiarity with such tools. The force needed to nearly decapitate 2 adult men, to crush skulls and sever fingers, indicated a level of physical strength and brutal efficiency. Witnesses who'd examined the scene noted that the axe swings must have been delivered with tremendous force, the kind a professional grubber would be capable of producing. Afkin also had a documented history of conflict with the Stelsried family. The exact nature of their disagreement has been lost to time, but neighbors knew it existed. They also knew Afkin's reputation. He was feared. People avoided confrontation with him. His temperament was volatile, his capacity for violence understood if not openly discussed. Deputy Hughes moved quickly. On March 22nd, immediately after the funeral service ended at Freevogel Cemetery, he arrested both Frederick Bolts and John Afkin on suspicion of murder. The men's reactions to arrest were telling in different ways. Bolts initially resisted, then demanded a Bible once he was confined to the Belleville City Jail. The request struck investigators as odd. Was this genuine religious conviction, or something more theatrical? Historical accounts note that some contemporaries wondered whether Bolts might have acted under religious excitement, though what exactly that meant remains unclear. Did they suspect religious mania, or was this simply the era's way of describing mental instability? Afkin's response was altogether different. He accompanied the officers without protest. He said nothing during the arrest, nothing during transport, nothing once placed in his cell. His silence was complete and, according to those who observed him, unsettling. Where Bolts showed emotion, fear, agitation, demands for spiritual comfort, Afkin displayed nothing at all. During the coroner's inquest, Bolts's behavior continued to draw attention. When presented with photographs of the victims' bodies, a relatively new investigative technique at the time, he refused to look at them. When pressed by the jury to examine the evidence, he turned away. Some interpreted this as guilt. Others wondered if it might simply be horror at what had been done to his wife's relatives. The evidence was circumstantial, the interpretations varied. The case proceeded to a grand jury in April 1874. This was where the investigation's limitations became apparent. The footprints leading to Boltz's property were suggestive but not conclusive. The red hair found in Carl Stelsried's hand was compelling but couldn't be definitively linked to Afghan, not with the technology and techniques available in 1874. The financial motive was clear, but motive alone wasn't enough for conviction. There were no witnesses to the actual murders. No one had seen either man at the Stelsried cabin on the night of March 19th. The grand jury declined to indict. Both men were released. For the residents of Saxtown, this was devastating. The physical evidence had seemed so clear. The trail literally led to Boltz's door. The red hair pointed to Afghan. The motive was obvious. And yet the legal system had determined there wasn't enough to proceed with a trial. The men who most of the community believed had murdered an entire family were walking free. But the investigation didn't end there. If anything, it expanded and fragmented. The local sheriff offered a reward of $1,000 for information leading to the capture and conviction of the killer or killers. This was a significant sum, enough to change a person's life. Family members added another $1,000 reward, $2,000 total, available to anyone who could solve the case. The rewards had an unintended effect. Private investigators and bounty hunters descended on Saxtown. These were men motivated purely by profit, willing to pursue any lead, no matter how tenuous, if it might result in a payout. They interviewed neighbors. They developed theories. They submitted names of suspects to local authorities. Within months, 8 different men from the Saxtown community had been arrested at various times on suspicion of involvement in the murders. Each arrest followed the same pattern. Someone would report suspicious behavior, an overheard conversation, a financial transaction that seemed questionable. Deputies would bring the man in for questioning. The interrogation would proceed, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. Without physical evidence or witnesses, the goal was always confession. Make the suspect uncomfortable enough, isolated enough, uncertain enough about what the authorities knew, and perhaps he would break down and admit to the crime. None of them did. Each of the 8 men was eventually released. The case against each one dissolved under scrutiny. The rewards remained unclaimed. The community response was predictable and tragic. Neighbors who'd lived peacefully beside each other for decades now viewed each other with suspicion. Accusations flew. Whispers spread. A man who'd argued with Fritz Stelsried over a property line became a suspect in some people's minds. Another who'd borrowed money and been slow to repay found himself the subject of rumors. The social fabric of Saxtown was tearing apart. Frederick Boltz, despite being released by the grand jury, found life in Saxtown impossible. The suspicion followed him everywhere. He'd been officially cleared, but in the court of community opinion, the verdict was different. He made a decision that would fuel speculation for generations. He sued the Stelsried estate for $400 and won the judgment. Then he, his wife, and their children moved away from Illinois entirely. They settled in Nebraska, and according to some accounts, Boltz changed his name. He was never seen in Saxtown again. This departure and the name change struck many as an admission of guilt. Why flee if you were innocent? Why change your identity? But others pointed out the obvious alternative explanation. Perhaps Boltz simply couldn't bear to live in a place where everyone believed him to be a murderer. Perhaps the judgment from the estate was his way of recovering the $200 he'd originally loaned, the debt that had started the feud in the first place. Perhaps the name change was about starting over, escaping the shadow of suspicion that would have followed him for the rest of his life. John Afkin made the opposite choice. He stayed in Saxtown. He continued working as a laborer. He walked the same roads, attended the same markets, lived among the same people who whispered about him. He never married. He rarely spoke, and he was often seen carrying a gold pocket watch, an expensive item, far beyond what a laborer's wages could typically afford. The elder Carl Stelsried had owned an identical pocket watch. When curious neighbors asked Afkin where he'd obtained such a fine timepiece, he would simply smile and offer no explanation. The investigation revealed other potential suspects as well. A brother-in-law who'd moved to Nebraska and changed his name, possibly Bolts, though some sources suggest this was a different relative, became a focus of suspicion. The theory was that this man might have hired someone to commit the murders, thereby clearing the way for inheritance money to flow to his wife's side of the family. Nicholas Pister, the journalist who spent a decade researching the case for his book The Axe Murders of Saxtown, identified this Nebraska connection as his most likely suspect. But most likely in a case with no definitive evidence still meant speculation. There was also the possibility of a transient killer, someone who drifted into the area, committed the murders for reasons unknown, and then disappeared. This theory had appeal precisely because it absolved the community. It meant the killer wasn't one of them, wasn't someone they'd trusted, wasn't someone they'd see at church or in town. But it didn't explain how the family dog had remained calm. It didn't explain why the Stelsrieds would have opened their door late at night to a stranger. It didn't account for the specific targeting of a family that had just received a substantial inheritance. As months passed without resolution, the case took on different dimensions. Ghost stories began to circulate. People claimed to hear footsteps near the Stelsried property at night. Lights appeared in windows of the empty cabin. Some said they'd seen figures moving through the trees near where the bodies had been found. These weren't just children's tales. Grown adults, sober-minded farmers, reported experiences they couldn't explain. The cabin itself became a source of dread. It stood empty for years, a physical reminder of what had happened there. Meanwhile, the legal aftermath continued to unfold in ways that deepened the community's divisions. Various family members from both sides, Stelsrieds and those connected by marriage, filed claims against the estate. Who had the right to the property? Who would inherit the money that had apparently motivated the murders? The courts became battlegrounds for disputes that might once have been settled over dinner tables or through quiet negotiation. The investigation had revealed something fundamental about law enforcement in 1874. Without modern forensic tools, without methods to definitively link a suspect to a crime scene, without witnesses willing to testify, even the most obvious trails of evidence couldn't guarantee justice. The system required either a confession or testimony from someone who'd seen the crime occur. In the absence of both, reasonable doubt prevailed. For the people of Saxtown, this was cold comfort. They looked at Frederick Boltz's flight and name change. They watched John Afkin walk past them with that gold pocket watch. They remembered the footprints that led to Boltz's door, the red hair in Carl Stelsried's dying grip. And they knew, in the way communities know things, that they understood what had happened even if they couldn't prove it in court. The murders had transformed Saxtown from a place defined by shared heritage and mutual support into a community fractured by suspicion and fear. Families that had worked together for a generation now kept their distance. Children were warned to stay away from certain neighbors. Doors that had once stood open now remained locked after dark. The investigation continued, technically, for years. Tips came in sporadically. Deathbed confessions were rumored but never substantiated. Someone would claim to have information, would meet with authorities, and the lead would dissolve into nothing. The reward money sat unclaimed. The case remained open, and the people of Saxtown lived with the understanding that whoever had killed the Stelsried family had gotten away with it. The absence of resolution creates its own kind of pressure. In communities where violent crime is rare, a single unsolved murder can reshape relationships and assumptions for generations. When that crime involves the systematic killing of an entire family, including children, the psychological weight becomes almost unbearable. Saxtown in the years following March 1874 was a place trying to maintain normalcy while knowing that normalcy was a fiction they were all consciously performing. The physical evidence remained tantalizingly clear in people's memories. Those footprints leading away from the cabin to Frederick Boltz's property weren't ambiguous. They were there. Multiple people had seen them, followed them, documented where they led. The tobacco pouch stained with blood, found along that same trail. The drag marks indicating someone had pulled an axe through the woods. These weren't rumors or speculation. They were observable facts that pointed to specific individuals. And yet the legal system had determined these facts weren't sufficient. This created a profound dissonance. How could such clear physical evidence fail to result in justice? The answer, uncomfortable then as it remains now, was that the investigative techniques of 1874 simply weren't sophisticated enough to transform observation into proof that could withstand legal scrutiny. Footprints showed someone had walked from the murder scene to Boltz's property, but they couldn't prove Boltz had been wearing those boots. The blood on the tobacco pouch indicated the person who dropped it had been at the scene, but it couldn't be definitively linked to any suspect. The red hair in Carl Stelsried's hand was circumstantial, suggestive, compelling, but not conclusive in a way that would satisfy a jury. The limitations of 19th-century law enforcement became starkly apparent in the Stelsried case. This was an era just before the transformative technologies that would revolutionize police work began to appear. Fingerprinting wouldn't be used in criminal investigations for another decade. Crime scene photography was in its infancy. Forensic pathology, the scientific examination of bodies to determine cause and manner of death, barely existed as a discipline. What investigators had were their observations, their interrogation skills, and the hope that someone would confess or come forward with direct testimony. None of that happened in Saxtown. Frederick Boltz maintained his innocence. John Afkin said nothing at all. The other suspects, when confronted, either had alibis or simply denied involvement. Without a confession, without a witness who'd seen the crime occur, the case couldn't move forward. The grand jury's decision not to indict wasn't a declaration of innocence. It was an acknowledgement that the available evidence, however suggestive, wouldn't meet the threshold required for conviction. This created lasting trauma for the community. Families that had intermarried, that had stood as witnesses at each other's weddings and baptisms, now wondered if they'd been breaking bread with murderers. The social trust that small communities depend on, the understanding that your neighbors share your values and will act accordingly, had been shattered. How could you trust anyone when the physical evidence pointed to specific people, but the law said it wasn't enough? Some residents made their positions clear through action. When relatives in Germany sent money to have the Stelsried family's remains moved from Freevogel Cemetery to the more prominent Walnut Hill Cemetery in Belleville, local residents blocked the attempt. A sexton named James arrived with hired hands to exhume the bodies. Word spread quickly through Saxtown. Farmers dropped their tools and rushed to the cemetery. When James and his workers arrived, they found armed men waiting. Some reportedly carried axes. The confrontation was brief. James was told in no uncertain terms that the Stelsrieds would remain where they'd been buried. The sexton and his assistants left without attempting to dig. The bodies stayed in Freevogel Cemetery, in 5 unmarked graves in the northwest corner. They're still there today, unmarked, while a 9-foot obelisk stands in their memory at Walnut Hill Cemetery, a monument to people buried 8 miles away. Why did the Saxtown residents prevent the removal of the bodies? Historical accounts offer conflicting explanations. Some sources suggest the church elders at Zion Evangelical, which owned the cemetery, forbade the removal. Others indicate it was a spontaneous community action driven by a sense that the murdered family belonged to Saxtown, that moving them would somehow be abandoning them. But there may have been another motivation. Keeping the graves unmarked, in an obscure corner of a small cemetery, meant keeping the murders present in the community's consciousness. It meant never allowing anyone to forget what had happened, who had been suspected, what justice had failed to deliver. The Stelsried cabin remained standing for 80 years after the murders. During that time, it became a focal point for ghost stories and reports of paranormal activity. People claimed to hear footsteps inside the empty structure. Lights appeared in windows where no one lived. Neighbors avoided the property after dark. Children dared each other to approach it, but few actually did. These stories served a psychological function. They kept the murders alive in collective memory when the legal system had closed the case. They provided a way to discuss what had happened without directly accusing specific individuals. After all, ghosts implied unfinished business, justice denied, spirits unable to rest. The haunting narratives allowed the community to acknowledge that something fundamental remained unresolved. In the 1950s, the cabin was finally demolished. A new structure was built on the property, though the old barn, where the women of Saxtown had prepared the bodies for burial, remained standing. Later, in the 1980s, a resident named Randy Eckert built a house on the site and moved in with his wife. They planned to stay for 2 years. During their residence, both reported unexplained phenomena. On one occasion, at 6 in the morning on March 19th, the anniversary of the murders, there was a loud knock on the door, while simultaneously someone seemed to walk up the basement steps. When they investigated, no one was there. Whether these experiences were genuine paranormal events, psychological responses to knowing the property's history, or simple coincidence is impossible to determine. What's notable is the persistence of such reports across different residents and decades. The location carried a weight that people felt, whether they attributed it to ghosts or simply the knowledge of what had occurred there. For Frederick Boltz and John Afkin, the aftermath took different forms. Boltz's departure from Illinois and subsequent name change effectively ended his story. He disappeared from historical records. Whether he built a successful life in Nebraska, whether he was haunted by suspicion in his new community, whether he maintained innocence until his death, none of this is known. His choice to leave suggests either guilt or the unbearable weight of constant suspicion. Both interpretations fit the facts equally well. John Afkin's decision to remain in Saxtown speaks to a different psychology. He continued working as a laborer, presumably interacting regularly with the same people who suspected him of involvement in the murders. He never married, which in that era and community would have been unusual. He carried that gold pocket watch openly despite, or perhaps because of, the questions it raised. His silence became a form of communication itself. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't running. He was there, every day, a living reminder of the case that couldn't be solved. The broader investigation sputtered along for years without producing new breakthroughs. Occasionally someone would come forward claiming to have information. These tips would be investigated, found lacking, and the case would return to its dormant state. The reward money remained unclaimed, suggesting either that no one had actionable information or that those who might have known something were unwilling to come forward. In a close-knit community, coming forward as a witness against a neighbor carried its own risks: social ostracism, potential retaliation, the destruction of family relationships if the accused was connected by marriage or blood to the witness. There were rumors of deathbed confessions. These were a common feature of 19th century crime narratives. The idea that someone who'd kept a terrible secret might, in their final moments, seek absolution by revealing the truth. Several Saxtown residents reportedly made confessions in their final days or hours. But none of these confessions were substantiated. They were heard by family members, passed along through whispers, transformed in the retelling. They became part of the murder's folklore rather than its facts. The Stelsried case also revealed the limitations of the bounty system as an investigative tool. While the rewards did generate tips and leads, they also created perverse incentives. Private investigators looking to claim the money had motivation to manufacture cases against innocent people if they believed they could make the evidence fit. The resulting arrests of 8 different men, none of whom were ultimately charged, showed how the promise of financial reward could complicate rather than clarify an investigation. What the case demonstrated most clearly was how unsolved violent crime affects community psychology. Saxtown didn't physically disappear. People continued farming, raising families, attending church. But the social bonds that had defined the settlement were permanently altered. Trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild. When that break occurs over something as fundamental as the murder of a family, when the guilty parties are believed to be known but can't be legally held accountable, the result is a kind of collective trauma that persists across generations. Children born after 1874 grew up hearing stories about the murders. They learned which families were suspected, which properties were associated with that terrible night. They absorbed the cautionary lessons. Doors should be locked. Strangers shouldn't be trusted. The appearance of normalcy could conceal terrible capacity for violence. The murders became the defining event in Saxtown's history, the moment when innocence ended and wariness began. For the families connected to the victims, the lack of resolution meant living with unanswered questions. Who had knocked on that door? Had Fritz recognized the voice? Had he suspected danger? Or had he opened the door thinking it was a neighbor in need? Why had the children been killed? Were they witnesses who had to be eliminated? Or had the violence simply been indiscriminate once it began? These questions had no answers, leaving nothing but speculation and grief. The case also raised questions about the nature of justice itself. If the legal system couldn't deliver accountability when the evidence seemed so clear, what was its purpose? This wasn't an abstract philosophical question for the people of Saxtown. It was immediate and personal. They'd followed the rules. They'd reported what they knew. They'd testified when asked. And still, nothing happened. The men they believed responsible walked free. This created a crisis of faith in institutions that would have lasting effects on how the community related to law enforcement and legal authorities. Some residents coped by developing elaborate theories about what had really happened. Perhaps it hadn't been Bolts and Afghan at all, but some other combination of suspects. Perhaps there was a conspiracy involving multiple families. Perhaps the inheritance money had been hidden and someone had tortured the family trying to find it. These alternative narratives served a purpose. They allowed people to continue searching for explanations when the official investigation had stalled. Others coped by simply not talking about it. They went about their lives, focused on the work that needed doing, and tried to move forward without resolution. But silence doesn't equal healing. The murders remained a presence in Saxtown life, visible in the way certain families avoided each other, in the routes people took to avoid passing particular properties, in the warnings parents gave children about where not to go and whom not to trust. The years turned into decades. The witnesses to the actual crime scene died. The generation that had known Carl, Fritz, Anna, and the children personally passed away. But the story persisted. It was told and retold, each retelling adding layers of interpretation and speculation. The facts remained fixed, but their meaning continued to be debated. New residents who moved into the area learned the history. The property where the cabin had stood changed hands multiple times, each new owner confronted with the knowledge of what had occurred there. By the early 20th century, the Saxtown murders had transitioned from recent crime to historical mystery. The principals were dead. Carl and Fritz Stelsried, Frederick Bolts, John Afghan, the investigators, the witnesses. What remained were records, newspaper accounts, court documents, cemetery markers, and stories passed down through families. The case had become folklore, but folklore rooted in documented fact. The physical landscape changed gradually. Saxtown as a distinct hamlet ceased to exist. The scattered farms were absorbed into the broader area around Millstadt. The small German-speaking enclave gave way to English-speaking descendants. The economic depression of the 1870s eventually ended. New technologies transformed farming, law enforcement, and daily life. By the 1950s, when the Stelsried cabin was finally demolished, the world it had existed in was unrecognizable to younger generations. But the story endured. Families in the area continued to tell it, each generation learning about the night in March 1874, when 5 people died in a log cabin a few miles from town. The details varied depending on who was telling it. Some emphasized the footprints leading to Boltz's door, others focused on the red hair in Carl Stelsried's fist. Still others constructed elaborate theories about hired killers or family conspiracies. But the core narrative remained consistent. An entire family murdered, strong suspicions about who was responsible, and no justice delivered. Nicholas Pister grew up in Millstadt in the latter decades of the 20th century. He heard the ghost stories about the Saxtown murders as a child. They kept him awake at night, he'd later admit. The thought of that unsolved crime, the idea that the killer might never have been caught, the horror of what had happened to that family. As a student at St. Louis University, a conversation with Father Francis Cleary sparked his curiosity about the historical truth behind the folklore. He began researching, tracking down newspaper archives, finding court documents, interviewing descendants of the families involved. The research would take him nearly a decade. He sent German-language newspaper accounts to translators in California. He visited Freevogel Cemetery, stood near where the unmarked graves were believed to be, examined the 9-foot obelisk at Walnut Hill Cemetery that honored the family buried miles away. He interviewed local historians, reviewed property records, traced family trees to understand the complex web of relationships that had existed in 1874 Saxtown. The result was the Axe Murders of Saxtown, published in 2014, which brought new attention to a case that had been largely forgotten outside the immediate area. Pister's investigation confirmed much of what the community had long believed, while also revealing the limitations that had prevented justice. The physical evidence really had pointed toward Bolts and Afghan. The footprints had been real, not fabricated. The financial motive existed. The red hair in Carl Stelsried's hand wasn't folklore. It appeared in multiple contemporary accounts. But proof sufficient for conviction in 1874 required either witnesses or confession, neither of which materialized. Pister's conclusion after exhaustive research was that a brother-in-law who'd fled to Nebraska and changed his name was the most likely suspect, though he acknowledged this was still speculation rather than certainty. Other researchers have pointed to different suspects. The truth is that without definitive evidence, the case remains open to interpretation. Multiple theories fit the available facts. The one conclusion everyone agrees on is that someone from within the community committed those murders. The family dog's calm behavior, the Stelsried's willingness to open their door late at night, the specific targeting of a family with newly acquired money. All of this points to someone known, someone trusted, someone who used that trust to gain entry and commit mass murder. The legal aftermath of the case set no precedents but illustrated existing limitations. Grand juries in the 19th century operated on probable cause standards that required substantial evidence. The Stelsried case had circumstantial evidence in abundance but lacked the direct proof needed to proceed to trial. This wasn't a failure of the grand jury, it was a function of the investigative tools available in 1874. Had the same crime occurred 50 years later, fingerprint analysis might have placed specific individuals at the scene. Forensic examination of the blood on the tobacco pouch might have provided genetic markers. Modern interrogation techniques might have produced different results. But these technologies didn't exist yet. The investigation proceeded with the tools at hand and reached the limits of what those tools could accomplish. The result was a community that knew, in the informal sense, what had happened while the formal legal system remained unable to act on that knowledge. The psychological impact on Saxtown extended far beyond the immediate aftermath. Studies of communities affected by unsolved violent crimes have shown patterns that would have been recognizable to anyone living in Saxtown in the decades following 1874. Elevated levels of suspicion and anxiety, breakdown of social cohesion, transmission of trauma across generations as children absorb their parents' unresolved fears and uncertainties. The murders became part of Saxtown's identity, shaping how residents thought about safety, trust, and their neighbors. The unmarked graves in Freevogel Cemetery remained a physical reminder of unresolved justice. The decision by local residents to prevent the bodies from being moved spoke to something deeper than simply honoring the dead. It was a refusal to allow the story to be buried, sanitized, or forgotten. The graves stayed unmarked not because the community didn't care, but because marking them would have implied closure. Unmarked graves in an obscure cemetery kept the wound open, kept the questions present. For researchers and true crime enthusiasts who've examined the case in recent decades, the Stelsried murders represent a particular type of historical puzzle. The evidence is detailed enough to form strong theories, but incomplete enough that certainty remains impossible. This is frustrating for those who seek definitive answers, but it's also revealing about the nature of historical knowledge. Much of what we think we know about the past comes from incomplete records, biased accounts, and gaps that can never be filled. The Saxtown case is unusually well documented for a rural crime in 1874, and yet even with newspaper coverage, court records, and family histories, critical questions remain unanswered. The case also raises questions about community justice versus legal justice. In Saxtown, most residents apparently believed they knew who killed the Stelsried family. That belief shaped their interactions, their business dealings, their social relationships. Frederick Bolts found life so unbearable under this informal judgment that he fled and changed his name. John Afghan endured it, but at what cost? He never married, rarely spoke, lived out his days under constant suspicion. This was a form of punishment outside the legal system, not formally sanctioned, but real in its effects. Whether that constitutes justice is a question each observer must answer for themselves. Modern investigations into historical cold cases sometimes yield surprising results. DNA evidence has solved murders decades old. New witnesses come forward with information they'd been afraid to share earlier. Documents turn up in unexpected archives. Could the Saxtown case ever be definitively solved? Probably not. The physical evidence is long gone. The witnesses are dead. Even if someone had kept a detailed confession in a diary or letter, after 150 years it would be difficult to verify its authenticity. The case will almost certainly remain in the realm of informed speculation rather than proven fact. What endures is the story itself and what it reveals about human nature, community dynamics, and the limitations of justice. The Stelzreed murders demonstrated how violence can fracture social bonds that took generations to build. They showed how economic pressures, unpaid debts, inheritance disputes, Depression-era survival struggles can create motivations for extreme acts. They illustrated the gap between moral certainty and legal proof, between what a community knows and what can be proven in court. The families connected to the victims carried their loss across generations. Children grew up without grandparents who'd been murdered. Property that should have passed through normal inheritance was divided through legal battles and contested claims. The trauma rippled outward, touching people who weren't born in 1874 but who grew up in its shadow. For the broader historical record, the Saxtown murders serve as a window into rural American life in the post-Civil War period. They reveal the isolation of farming communities, the strength of ethnic and linguistic bonds among German immigrants, the rough justice of the frontier era, and the economic anxieties of the Depression years. They show us a world where a $200 debt could lead to mass murder, where communities protected their own even when their own included suspected killers, and where law enforcement operated with tools we'd consider primitive but which were state-of-the-art for their time. The case has been featured in various true crime compilations, local history books, and now Pister's detailed investigation. Each retelling adds new layers of interpretation while the core facts remain fixed. 5 people died violently on the night of March 19, 1874. Physical evidence pointed to specific suspects. No one was ever convicted. The community fractured. The graves remain unmarked. For visitors to Freevogel Cemetery today, there's nothing to indicate where the Stelzreed family rests. You'd walk past the northwest corner without realizing 5 murdered people lie beneath the earth there. The obelisk at Walnut Hill Cemetery honors them in a place they were never buried. This peculiar arrangement, bodies in one location, memorial in another, seems fitting for a case where physical facts and their legal recognition never aligned. Saxtown as a place name has largely disappeared from modern maps. The properties have changed hands multiple times. New families live where the murders occurred, most unaware of the history. Life continued as it always does. But the story persists because it touches something fundamental about how we think about justice, safety, and the communities we live in. The questions the case raises are uncomfortable. Can we ever feel truly safe when we know that people we trust might be capable of terrible violence? What does it mean for a community when everyone believes they know who committed a crime but the legal system can't act? How do we balance the presumption of innocence with strong circumstantial evidence? When formal justice fails, what informal mechanisms take its place? And are those mechanisms themselves just? There are no easy answers. The Stelzreed family died 150 years ago. Most likely, whoever killed them died long ago as well, taking the complete truth with them. What remains is memory, speculation, and the lasting understanding that some crimes change communities forever regardless of whether justice is served. The investigation into the Saxtown murders is officially cold but never truly closed. It can't be closed while questions remain, while descendants still tell the story, while researchers continue to examine the evidence. The case exists in that peculiar space where the past isn't quite past, where events long ago continue to matter because they were never resolved. For those fascinated by true crime, The Stelsried case offers a different kind of narrative than modern forensic investigations. There are no DNA results to reveal the killer's identity. No surveillance footage shows who approached that cabin. No cell phone records place suspects at the scene. What exists is human testimony, physical evidence interpreted through 19th century methods, and the collective memory of a community that lived with the aftermath. The murders serve as a reminder of how much investigative science has advanced in 150 years, and also of how some aspects of crime remain consistent across time. Motive, means, and opportunity, these haven't changed. Financial disputes, family resentments, the capacity for violence when pressures accumulate. These are constants in human behavior. What's changed is our ability to prove who acted on those impulses. If there's a lesson in the Saxtown case, it might be about the importance of evidence preservation and investigative technique. The crime scene was compromised almost immediately by hundreds of onlookers. Key evidence may have been destroyed or contaminated. Witnesses weren't interviewed systematically. The investigation proceeded based on common sense and local knowledge rather than systematic methodology. These weren't failures of the investigators, they were doing what law enforcement did in 1874. But the contrast with modern practices is stark. The case also demonstrates the power of narrative to keep history alive. Without Nicholas Pister's research and book, the Stelsried murders might have been completely forgotten outside family stories and local folklore. His decade of investigation ensured that the victims, the suspects, and the community's response would be preserved for future examination. In that sense, his work was itself a form of justice, not legal accountability, but historical recognition that these people existed, this crime occurred, and it mattered. The 5 unmarked graves in Freevogel Cemetery remain. The 9-foot obelisk at Walnut Hill Cemetery stands as a memorial to people buried elsewhere. The property where the cabin stood has been built on, torn down, and built on again. Saxtown is mostly a memory, but the story endures. And perhaps that's the only resolution possible for some cases, not justice in the legal sense, but the refusal to forget. The understanding that what happened that night in March 1874 was terrible enough that it deserves to be remembered, even when it can't be fully understood or avenged. The questions remain open. Who knocked on that door? Why did the family let them in? What exactly motivated the violence? We can form theories, examine evidence, follow the footprints through the woods. But the complete truth died with the people who took it to their graves, both the victims who experienced those final terrible moments and whoever carried out the murders. What we're left with is the shadow of events, preserved in documents and memory, a case that can be studied but never quite solved, a crime that shaped a community for generations and continues, in small ways, to echo into the present. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Girl Who Walked into the Storm. A young voice calls out in the dark. No one answers. Asha Degree was 9 years old when she disappeared from her home in the early morning hours of February 14, 2000. To understand why this particular case has haunted investigators for over 2 decades, you need to understand who Asha was, and more importantly, who she wasn't. The Degree family lived in Shelby, North Carolina, a small town tucked into the foothills where everyone knew their neighbors and children played outside until the streetlights came on. It was the kind of place where parents still felt comfortable letting their kids ride bikes to the corner store, where church on Sunday wasn't optional, and where a missing child was something that happened in other places on the evening news to other families. Harold and Aquila Degree were protective parents. They weren't helicopter parents by today's standards, but they were cautious. Their 2 children, Asha and her older brother O'Brien had structure in their lives. Bedtimes were firm. The house had rules. Asha wasn't the type of child who pushed boundaries or sought out trouble. Friends and family would later describe her as shy, obedient, sweet-natured. She loved basketball and had recently joined a local team, though she struggled with the competitive aspects of the sport. She enjoyed reading and was doing well in school. In the photographs from that time, Asha appears as a bright-eyed girl with beaded braids, smiling cautiously at the camera. There's a gentleness to her expression that makes what happened next even harder to process. February 13th, 2000, was a Sunday. The family attended church services that morning, then returned home to a quiet afternoon. Later, Asha and O'Brien attended a cousin's basketball game. Asha's own team had lost a game the day before, her first loss, and she'd been quieter than usual afterward, perhaps disappointed in herself. But nothing about her demeanor that weekend suggested distress or fear. She seemed like a normal 9-year-old processing a minor childhood setback. That evening, the power went out due to storms moving through the area. Thunder rolled across the North Carolina hills. Rain hammered against the windows. The Degree family weathered the outage together, and when the lights came back on around 8 o'clock, the children were told to get ready for bed. School was the next day. Asha and O'Brien shared a bedroom. Their beds were positioned so the children could see each other across the room. Around 9 p.m., both children were in bed. Aquila checked on them throughout the evening, as she always did. Harold came home from his shift at a local printing company around 12:30 a.m. He looked in on the children. Both were asleep in their beds. The house settled into the particular silence that comes after a storm. Outside, the rain had eased to a drizzle, but the wind still moved through the trees with a low, persistent whisper. Sometime between 2:30 and 3 a.m. on February 14th, Asha Degree got out of her bed. She was wearing a white shirt and white pants. Accounts vary on whether these were pajamas or the clothes she'd laid out for school. She put on her white sneakers. Then she walked out of the bedroom she shared with her brother, through the house where her parents slept, and out the front door into the cold, wet darkness of a February night in rural North Carolina. She was 9 years old. She was afraid of dogs and scared of the dark. And she left anyway. O'Brien would later tell investigators that he heard his sister's bed squeak during the night, sometime around 2:30 a.m. He assumed she was getting up to use the bathroom and went back to sleep. When Aquila came to wake the children for school at 5:45 a.m., she found O'Brien alone in the room. Asha's bed was empty. The initial assumption, the one any parent would make, was that Asha was somewhere in the house. Children hide. They fall asleep in odd places. But as the minutes passed and the search grew more frantic, that hope dissolved. Asha wasn't in the bathroom, the kitchen, the living room. She wasn't hiding in a closet or under furniture. She was gone. Harold called 911 at 6:39 a.m. By 6:40, Cleveland County Sheriff's deputies were en route to 3404 Oakcrest Drive. By 7 a.m., volunteers were gathering. By mid-morning, the story was spreading through Shelby like a cold wind. A little girl had vanished from her home in the middle of the night during a storm. But this wasn't a case of a child snatched from her bedroom. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing appeared disturbed. The doors had been unlocked. The Degrees later acknowledged they sometimes left doors unlocked overnight in their quiet neighborhood. But there was no evidence of an intruder. The FBI joined the investigation within hours. Search teams combed the woods surrounding the Degree home. Bloodhounds picked up Asha's scent and tracked it from the house, down the driveway, to the edge of Highway 18, a rural 2-lane road that curved through farmland and forest south of Shelby. Then the scent went cold, as if she'd stepped off the earth itself. It was the questions that made this case strange from the beginning. Not the usual questions investigators ask in a missing child case. Who took her? Where is she? Is she alive? But more fundamental ones. Why would a shy, obedient 9-year-old girl who was afraid of the dark leave her home in the middle of a stormy night? Where was she trying to go? And perhaps most troubling, was she running towards something or away from it? The first 24 hours passed, then 48. The volunteers kept searching, but hope was already turning into something heavier. Then witnesses began coming forward with information that would transform the case from mysterious to nearly inexplicable. On February 15th, the day after Asha was reported missing, a truck driver named Jeff Rupp contacted the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office. He'd been driving south on Highway 18 around 4:00 a.m. on Valentine's Day morning when his headlights caught something that made him slow down. A small figure walking along the side of the road. The location was approximately 1.25 miles from the Degree home. The figure appeared to be a young African-American girl wearing light-colored clothing and a light-colored jacket. She was walking south in the same direction as traffic. The rain had mostly stopped by then, but it was cold, temperatures in the low 40s, and the pavement was still wet. Rupp slowed his truck, concerned. It was the middle of the night. This was a child, clearly alone, walking along a rural highway. But as his truck approached, the small figure turned and looked directly at the headlights. Then she ran, not toward the truck, seeking help. Away from it, she darted off the road and disappeared into the tree line. Rupp considered stopping, but the girl had vanished so quickly into the woods that he wasn't sure he could find her in the dark. He continued driving and called authorities as soon as he reached his destination. By the time his report was taken and investigators returned to the location, hours had passed. A second witness came forward the same day. Roy Blanton and his wife were driving home from a Valentine's Day trip around 3:45 a.m., roughly 15 minutes before the truck driver's sighting. They'd been traveling north on Highway 18 in the opposite direction when their headlights illuminated a small figure walking along the southbound shoulder. Blanton's wife was struck by how small the person was and how inappropriate the clothing seemed for the weather and hour. Blanton himself noticed something else. The figure seemed purposeful, walking with determination rather than wandering aimlessly. They didn't stop at the time. It was dark, the roads were slick, and the figure was moving away from them. But when they heard about the missing girl the next day, both immediately recognized the possible connection. The sightings were credible. Both witnesses were specific about times, locations, and details. Both described clothing consistent with what Asha had been wearing. The timeline worked. If Asha had left her home around 3 a.m. and walked along the shoulder of Highway 18, she would have reached that stretch of road right around the time these drivers saw her. Investigators returned to the area with renewed focus. This was no longer a case of a child who'd wandered off and gotten lost near her home. Asha had traveled more than a mile from her house, along a dark highway, in the middle of the night. And when someone tried to help her, she'd run away. The search intensified around the Highway 18 corridor. Volunteers combed both sides of the road. Deputies walked the tree line. Helicopters made passes overhead. On February 17th, 3 days after Asha disappeared, searchers made several discoveries that confirmed she had indeed been in the area. Just inside the tree line near where the sightings occurred, investigators found a few items. A Mickey Mouse hair bow that Asha's family recognized, and candy wrappers from treats she'd received at a recent birthday party. The items were found roughly 90 feet from the road, suggesting she'd moved deeper into the woods after running from the truck driver's headlights. But there was nothing else. No trail leading further into the forest. No signs of where she'd gone from there. No evidence of a vehicle stopping, though investigators believed someone must have picked her up, either on the highway or after she emerged from the woods somewhere down the road. The investigation expanded in every direction. Detectives interviewed family members, friends, teachers, neighbors, and church congregation members. They looked at registered sex offenders in the area. They examined Asha's activities in the days and weeks before her disappearance. They asked questions about her home life, her school life, her emotional state. No red flags emerged. The Degree family was cooperative and consistent. Friends and relatives described a normal, loving household. Teachers said Asha was a good student with no behavioral concerns. There were no reports of abuse or neglect. No suspicious adults lurking around the neighborhood or the school. No recent arguments or traumatic events beyond the lost basketball game. Yet something had motivated a 9-year-old child to walk out of her safe, warm home into a cold, dark night during a storm. The investigation kept circling back to that central mystery. Detectives developed theories. Perhaps Asha had been lured out by someone she knew, someone she trusted enough to meet in the middle of the night. Perhaps she'd planned to run away for reasons known only to her. Perhaps she'd been groomed by a predator who'd convinced her this was an adventure, not a danger. Each theory had problems. Each left questions unanswered. One detail particularly troubled investigators. Why would Asha pack a backpack? Searchers had found evidence suggesting Asha hadn't left impulsively. Her book bag was missing from the house, and relatives confirmed she'd had a small backpack she kept personal items in. This suggested planning, preparation. But what does a 9-year-old plan for when she leaves home in the middle of a February night? The basketball game loss was examined closely. Some theorized that Asha, upset by her team's defeat, might have been running away from perceived failure. But the timing seemed off. Why wait 2 nights to leave? And why leave during a storm? Children who run away typically do so in anger, taking obvious routes, making noise. Asha appeared to have left quietly, carefully, without waking anyone in the house. Another theory focused on Valentine's Day. February 14th is a day associated with romance, gifts, attention. Could someone have convinced Asha they had a special surprise waiting for her? Something she needed to come out in secret to receive? It was possible but felt thin. Asha was 9, not a teenager seeking romantic attention. As February turned to March, the physical search gradually wound down. Every inch of the likely search areas had been covered multiple times. The case transitioned from an active search to an active investigation. Tips continued to come in. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands over the years. Each was followed up, documented, cross-referenced. But Asha Degree had vanished as completely as if the earth had opened up and swallowed her. The FBI developed age progression images showing what Asha might look like as she grew older. Her photograph appeared on missing children posters across the country. The case was featured on national television programs. Rewards were offered. The Cleveland County Sheriff's Office kept the case open and active, revisiting evidence and leads as new technologies and techniques became available. The Degree family held on to hope, as families do. They gave interviews. They participated in awareness campaigns. They marked each February 14th with renewed pleas for information. Harold and Aquila held their family together through something no parent should ever have to endure: not knowing. Not knowing is its own special torture. It's the hope that won't die and the fear that won't sleep. It's checking the phone every day for 24 years, wondering if today will be the day someone calls with news. It's seeing girls who would be Asha's age and doing the math. She'd be in college now, she'd be getting married now, she'd be 33 now. Then, in August of 2001, 18 months after Asha disappeared, a discovery was made that would confirm the worst fears while somehow deepening the mystery even further. A construction crew was working along Highway 18 in Burke County, North Carolina, roughly 26 miles north of where Asha had last been seen. They were digging along the roadside, preparing the ground for a subdivision development, when one of the workers noticed something odd in the soil. Plastic, wrapped around something solid. They pulled it from the earth. It was a white plastic bag, heavy-duty, wrapped multiple times around its contents. Inside that bag was another bag. The construction workers could feel something substantial inside, something with weight and shape. They flagged down a supervisor. Someone called the police. When investigators carefully opened the layers of plastic, they found a child's backpack. It contained clothing and several personal items. Among them, a photograph of a little girl from Asha Degree's age group, a book from Asha's school library, and other items that would later be linked to her. The backpack had been deliberately buried and carefully concealed. The layering of plastic bags suggested an attempt to protect the contents from moisture and decay. The location, off a highway in an area being developed, indicated someone had chosen a spot they thought might remain undisturbed. DNA and forensic analysis confirmed what investigators already knew in their hearts. These were Asha's belongings. The discovery answered one question and raised a dozen more. Asha had traveled at least 26 miles from where she'd last been sighted. She'd either been taken there, or her belongings had. Someone had possession of her backpack long enough to travel that distance and bury it with methodical care. Why bury the backpack? Why not simply dispose of it in a dumpster or burn it? The burial suggested someone who understood forensic evidence, someone who knew that items could retain DNA and other identifying traces, someone who wanted those items hidden but perhaps also preserved. The location nagged at investigators. Highway 18 runs through rural North Carolina, connecting small towns through farmland and forest. Burke County, where the backpack was found, is less populated than Cleveland County. The burial site was isolated enough that someone could have pulled off the road, dug a hole, and buried the bag without being observed, but it was also along a highway traveled regularly enough that it wasn't completely remote. Had the person who took Asha driven her north on Highway 18, past her home, past the witnesses who'd seen her walking? Or had they gone south first, then doubled back? Was the burial site chosen randomly, or did it have significance? The investigation refocused around the Burke County location. Police looked for similar cases in that area. They re-interviewed witnesses. They examined traffic cameras and business security footage from the days following Asha's disappearance, though much of that material no longer existed after 18 months. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children produced updated age progression images. FBI behavioral analysts built psychological profiles of the likely perpetrator. Organized, careful, possibly local to the area, someone with enough connection to Asha to gain her trust. The profile suggested someone who might have groomed her over time, building a relationship that would make her willing to leave home to meet them. But nobody fit perfectly. Every promising lead dissolved under scrutiny. Every theory had holes. In 2016, 16 years after Asha disappeared, the FBI and Cleveland County Sheriff's Office made an unusual move. They released photographs of specific items found with Asha's belongings. One was a Dr. Seuss book, McElligott's Pool. The other was a distinctive photograph of a young African-American girl, not Asha, wearing a t-shirt from a family reunion, posing in front of what appeared to be a vehicle. The girl in the photo appeared to be around Asha's age or slightly younger. Investigators believed these items might help identify someone connected to Asha's case. Perhaps the photo had been given to her by someone she knew. Perhaps the book had been read to her by someone who later took her. The release of these images was strategic. They were hoping someone would recognize them and make a connection. Tips came in, but nothing conclusive. The photograph remains unidentified. The book's origin unclear. Over the years, investigators have conducted multiple searches of properties, followed up on thousands of tips, and brought in outside experts to review evidence. In 2024, 24 years after Asha's disappearance, the case remains open and active. The Cleveland County Sheriff's Office has never closed it, never filed it away as cold. They still receive tips regularly. They still follow up on every credible lead. They still hope that somewhere, someone knows what happened to Asha Degree and will finally come forward. But the questions persist. Who took Asha? What happened to her after she left that highway in the early morning hours of February 14, 2000? Why did she leave her home? And the most painful question of all, the one her family has lived with for 2.5 decades. Is she still alive? Statistics and experience suggest the answer is likely no. Children who are taken by strangers rarely survive long, especially when years pass without contact or ransom demands. But there are exceptions. There are cases where missing children are found alive decades later. Hope is stubborn, and sometimes hope is all families have. The evidence suggests Asha was taken by someone who planned carefully. The backpack burial indicates an attempt to conceal evidence while perhaps keeping souvenirs. The fact that Asha left willingly, walking along a highway rather than being forcibly abducted from her home, suggests someone she knew or someone who had gained her trust. But who, and how, and why has that person never been identified, never slipped up, never confessed or been caught in another crime that connected them to this one? The thing about unsolved cases is that they don't end. They suspend. They exist in a state of permanent present tense, always ongoing, never concluded. For the investigators who've worked Asha's case over the past 24 years, she's never stopped being missing. For her family, she's never stopped being 9 years old, walking into a February storm. Harold and Aquila Degree still live in Shelby. They've maintained Asha's room, kept her belongings, and continued to mark every birthday she's missed and every February 14th that passes without answers. O'Brien, Asha's older brother, has spoken publicly about growing up in the shadow of his sister's disappearance, how it shaped his childhood, his family, his sense of safety in the world. The Shelby community hasn't forgotten Asha. Every year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, there are vigils, prayer services, renewed calls for information. Billboards bearing her face still appear along North Carolina highways. The case remains prominent in the public consciousness, at least locally, in a way many missing children cases don't. Part of what keeps Asha's case alive is its strangeness. The facts don't form a neat narrative. They resist easy explanation. A 9-year-old girl who was afraid of the dark walked into darkness. A child who was obedient and sheltered left her home in the middle of a storm. A shy girl who should have run toward help ran away from it. These contradictions haunt the case. They suggest that whatever happened to Asha, whatever motivated her to leave, was powerful enough to override her natural instincts and fears. Something or someone convinced her that leaving was necessary, even desirable. Investigators have explored the possibility of grooming at length. Online predators weren't as prevalent in 2000 as they are now, but they existed. However, the Degree family did not have internet access at home. Asha's computer use was limited to school, always supervised. Her phone access was similarly restricted. The opportunities for an online predator to contact and groom her were minimal. That points back toward someone in her physical orbit. Family friends, church congregation, school staff, coaches, neighbors. Everyone in those circles has been investigated, some multiple times. No one has emerged as a clear suspect. Some investigators have theorized that Asha might have been lured out by someone she didn't know well, perhaps through a brief interaction that seemed innocent. A chance meeting where someone learned enough about her to craft a convincing reason for her to leave home. But that theory requires an almost implausible level of criminal sophistication and luck. The most painful theories are the ones that suggest Asha left because she was unhappy at home, that something was happening in the Degree household that made leaving seem preferable to staying. These theories have been exhaustively investigated. Social services had no involvement with the family. Teachers, friends, and relatives all described a normal, loving home. There's no credible evidence of abuse or neglect. Yet the doubt lingers, as it does in all cases where a child leaves voluntarily. Because children don't leave good situations in the middle of the night during storms. Or do they? The human mind, especially a child's mind, can be mysterious. Small things can feel huge. Temporary emotions can drive permanent actions. It's possible Asha left for reasons that made sense to a 9-year-old girl in that moment but would make no sense to anyone else. The legal aftermath of Asha's case is limited because no one has ever been charged. There have been no arrests, no trials, no convictions. The case remains open as a missing person investigation, though it's functionally treated as a homicide. Without a body, without a suspect, without a confession, there's no path to prosecution. That may change. DNA technology continues to evolve. Forensic techniques improve. Cold cases that seemed unsolvable 30 years ago are being cracked open now through genetic genealogy and advanced analysis. Evidence from Asha's case has been preserved and is periodically retested as new methods become available. There's also the possibility that someone will talk. Most crimes involve more than one person, even if only peripherally. Someone helps dispose of evidence. Someone provides an alibi. Someone notices something odd and stays quiet. As years pass, relationships break down, guilt compounds, deathbed confessions happen. Someone who was protecting a friend or family member in 2000 might not feel the same loyalty in 2026. The psychological impact of Asha's case extends beyond her immediate family. It affected an entire community's sense of safety and innocence. Shelby was a place where parents felt comfortable, where children had freedom, where the world still felt mostly safe. Asha's disappearance shattered that. In the years since, the way parents supervise children has changed dramatically, driven partly by cases like Asha's and partly by broader cultural shifts. The freedom children had in 2000, to walk to school alone, to play outside unsupervised, to exist without constant adult monitoring, has largely disappeared. Whether that's good or bad is debatable, but Asha's case is part of why it changed. The true crime community has adopted Asha's case as one of its most discussed mysteries. Reddit threads, podcast episodes, YouTube videos, and blog posts have analyzed every angle, proposed countless theories, and kept her story circulating. This attention is both helpful and harmful. It keeps pressure on investigators and keeps the case in public awareness, which could lead to tips. But it also generates misinformation, wild speculation, and sometimes harassment of people connected to the case. The responsible approach to discussing Asha's case, the one investigators prefer, is to focus on facts, stick to confirmed details, and avoid sensational theories that can't be supported by evidence. Asha was a real child. Her family's grief is real. The investigation is ongoing and active. Treating her case as entertainment or an intellectual puzzle disrespects all of that. What remains are the enduring questions that define this case. Why did Asha leave? Who did she meet on that highway? What happened to her after the witnesses saw her walking in the dark? Where is she now? For 24 years, those questions have gone unanswered. The silence around them has become its own presence, heavy and persistent. It hangs over Shelby, over Highway 18, over every February 14th that arrives without resolution. Asha would be 33 years old now. She'd have lived more than 3/4 of her life since she disappeared. She might have gone to college, had a career, fallen in love, had children of her own. Instead, she exists frozen at 9 years old, forever walking along a dark highway in a storm, forever turning away from headlights that might have saved her, forever running into trees that swallowed her whole. The Cleveland County Sheriff's Office maintains a dedicated tip line. They've never stopped investigating. Every lead, no matter how old, is still considered viable. Every anniversary brings renewed appeals for information. Someone somewhere knows something. That's what investigators believe. That's what they have to believe. Because the alternative, that this mystery is genuinely unsolvable, that Asha's fate will never be known, that her family will die without answers, is unbearable. So the investigation continues. The billboards stay up. The tip line stays open. The age progression photos get updated. And somewhere in Shelby, North Carolina, a bedroom stays preserved as it was on February 13th, 2000, waiting for a girl who walked out one night and never came home. The storm passed. The sun rose. Life went on for everyone except Asha Degree. And somewhere, someone knows why. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 2. The Road to Nowhere, The Disappearance of Leah Roberts. In March of 2000, a Jeep Cherokee was found at the bottom of a steep embankment in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State. The vehicle had crashed through a guardrail, rolled several times, and come to rest against the trees below. When authorities arrived, they found camping gear, clothing, and personal belongings scattered inside. The driver's seat had been positioned almost completely flat, as though someone had been sleeping there. The battery was missing, so were the license plates, and so was the young woman who had been driving. Her name was Leah Roberts. She was 23 years old, and she had been on a road trip alone. What investigators would discover in the weeks that followed raised more questions than it answered, because the crash scene didn't look like an accident. And Leah's journey, it turned out, had been anything but ordinary. Leah Toby Roberts was born on January 23, 1977, in Durham, North Carolina. She grew up in a close-knit family that valued education, curiosity, and connection. Her father was a professor. Her mother was warm and attentive. Leah had an older sister, and the two shared the kind of bond that comes from being raised in a home where conversation mattered and ideas were encouraged. By all accounts, Leah was a thoughtful child. She read widely, asked questions, and seemed to carry herself with a quiet confidence that set her apart. She wasn't loud or attention-seeking. She was the kind of person who listened more than she spoke, who thought carefully before responding, who seemed to be paying attention to the world in a way that others often overlooked. She attended college at North Carolina State University, where she studied psychology. Friends from that time remember her as introspective and deeply empathetic. She was the person people went to when they needed to talk. She had a way of making others feel heard, understood, and less alone. But those same friends also noticed something else. Leah had a habit of disappearing into her own thoughts. She could be present in a room and still seem miles away. In 1997, when Leah was 20 years old, her mother died suddenly. The loss was devastating. Leah had been close to her mother, and the grief that followed was not something she spoke about easily. She withdrew. She stopped attending classes regularly. She spent more time alone. Her sister noticed the change, but Leah insisted she was fine. She always insisted she was fine. Then, in 1999, her father died. Within 2 years, Leah had lost both parents. She was 22 years old. The double loss seemed to shatter something in her. Friends described her as adrift. She moved back home to Durham, living in the house where she had grown up, surrounded by the belongings and memories of people who were no longer there. She took a job at a local bookstore. She went through the motions, but those who knew her could see that she was struggling with something she couldn't quite name. Leah began talking about leaving, not just leaving Durham, but leaving everything behind. She spoke about wanting to start over, to go somewhere no one knew her, to figure out who she was without the weight of her past pressing down on her. Her sister tried to reassure her, to remind her that grief takes time, that healing doesn't happen all at once. But Leah had made up her mind. In early March of 2000, Leah withdrew a significant amount of money from her bank account. She packed her Jeep Cherokee with camping gear, clothes, books, and a journal. She told her sister she was going on a road trip. She said she needed to clear her head. She promised she would stay in touch. On March 9, 2000, Leah Roberts left Durham, North Carolina, driving west. She was alone. The trip, at first, seemed to follow a loose itinerary. Leah had mentioned wanting to visit friends in different cities, to see places she had never been, to spend time in nature. She made several stops along the way. She called her sister from the road, though the conversations were brief. She sent a few postcards. She seemed to be moving with purpose, though it wasn't entirely clear what that purpose was. On March 13th, Leah arrived in Bellingham, Washington, a small city near the Canadian border. She stayed with a friend there for a few days. The friend later told investigators that Leah seemed tired but not distressed. She talked about continuing north into Canada, about maybe finding work somewhere along the coast, about wanting to be near the water. She didn't say she was running from anything. She didn't say she was afraid. But she also didn't say much about where she was going next. On March 18th, Leah left Bellingham. She told her friend she was heading toward the mountains, that she wanted to spend some time camping before deciding on her next move. She hugged her friend goodbye, climbed into her Jeep, and drove away. That was the last time anyone saw her. When Leah didn't call her sister as planned, concern began to set in. Days passed, then a week. Her sister tried calling, but there was no answer. She reached out to friends, asking if anyone had heard from Leah. No one had. On March 23, 2000, Leah's sister filed a missing person report. 2 days later, on March 25th, a driver traveling along a remote stretch of Highway 20 in the North Cascades noticed something unusual. There was a gap in the guardrail and fresh tire marks leading off the road. The driver stopped and looked over the edge. Below, barely visible through the trees, was a vehicle. Authorities were called. When they reached the scene, they found Leah's Jeep Cherokee. It had gone off the road, crashed through the guardrail, and tumbled down a steep embankment. The vehicle had rolled multiple times before coming to rest against a cluster of trees, roughly 200 feet below the highway. The crash site was difficult to access. The terrain was steep and heavily forested. The weather had been cold and wet in the days leading up to the discovery, and snow still clung to the higher elevations. When investigators finally reached the Jeep, they began to take note of the details. The driver's seat was reclined almost flat. There was a sleeping bag inside. Camping gear, clothing, and personal items were scattered throughout the vehicle. A box of Cheerios sat on the passenger seat. There were maps, books, and Leah's journal. But there was no sign of Leah. And then they noticed something else. The license plates were missing. The battery had been removed. And on the back window of the Jeep, someone had used a finger to write a message in the condensation. It said, "Tanya." When investigators began examining the crash site more closely, they encountered a series of details that didn't align with a straightforward accident. The guardrail had been breached, yes. The vehicle had clearly gone off the road with enough force to roll down the embankment. But the positioning of the Jeep, the condition of the interior, and the missing components all suggested something more complicated. The first thing that stood out was the battery. It had been completely removed from the vehicle. Not damaged in the crash. Not dislodged. Removed. The cables had been disconnected cleanly, and the battery was gone. There was no practical reason for someone to remove a battery from a crashed vehicle in the middle of nowhere unless they were taking it with them. The license plates were also missing. Both front and rear plates had been taken off. Again, this wasn't consistent with an accident. It suggested deliberate action. Then there was the message on the window. The name Tanya had been written in what appeared to be condensation or dust on the rear window of the Jeep. Investigators couldn't determine when it had been written or by whom. Leah's sister didn't recognize the name. Neither did any of Leah's known friends or acquaintances. It was a detail that seemed to point toward something, but no one could say what. The condition of the Jeep itself raised additional questions. While the vehicle had clearly sustained damage from the crash, it wasn't totaled. The frame was intact. The doors could still be opened. If someone had been inside during the crash, they would likely have been injured, possibly seriously. But there was no blood inside the vehicle. No signs of trauma. No indication that anyone had been hurt. Search teams were brought in. They combed the surrounding area on foot, looking for any sign of Leah. The terrain was difficult, dense with vegetation and steep in places. The weather remained cold and unpredictable. Volunteers joined the effort, spreading out across the forest, calling her name, checking ravines and clearings. They found nothing. As the investigation continued, detectives began piecing together Leah's movements in the days leading up to the crash. They spoke with the friend she had stayed with in Bellingham. They reviewed her bank records, phone calls, and correspondence. They tried to build a timeline that might explain how she ended up on that remote stretch of highway. What they discovered was that Leah had been alone for most of her trip. She had made a few stops, spoken briefly with acquaintances, but she hadn't confided in anyone about her plans. She had been vague about where she was going and why. In her journal, which was recovered from the Jeep, she wrote about feeling lost, about wanting to disappear, about needing to become someone new. The entries were raw and personal. She wrote about her parents, about the grief that wouldn't let go, about the sense that she no longer fit into the life she had been living. She wrote about wanting to drive until she ran out of road, about the appeal of vanishing into the wilderness and never coming back. But she also wrote about fear, about feeling watched, about the sense that something was following her. Investigators didn't know what to make of it. Was it paranoia, depression, or had something actually happened to her? The crash site itself became a focal point of the investigation. Accident reconstruction specialists were brought in to analyze the scene. They measured skid marks, examined the guardrail, and studied the trajectory of the vehicle. Their conclusion was troubling. The crash didn't appear to be accidental. The skid marks suggested that the Jeep had been traveling at a relatively low speed when it left the road. There were no signs of hard braking or loss of control. The vehicle seemed to have simply driven off the highway, through the guardrail and down the embankment. It was possible, the specialist said, that the crash had been staged. But if it had been staged, who had staged it? And why? One theory was that Leah had staged the crash herself, that she had deliberately driven off the road, removed the battery and plates, and walked away, that she had wanted to disappear and had created the appearance of an accident to cover her tracks. But that theory had problems. If Leah had walked away from the crash, where had she gone? The area was remote, miles from the nearest town. The weather had been harsh. She had left behind her camping gear, her clothes, and her journal. If she had been planning to start a new life, why leave everything behind? Another theory was that someone else had been involved, that Leah had picked up a hitchhiker or that she had been followed, that something had happened on that stretch of road that resulted in her disappearance. The message on the window, the missing battery, the staged appearance of the crash, all of it pointed toward the possibility that someone else had been there. But there was no evidence of another person. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no signs of struggle. As weeks turned into months, the case grew colder. Leah's family held out hope that she would be found. They distributed flyers, gave interviews, and kept her name in the public eye. Her sister spoke about the pain of not knowing, about the impossibility of moving forward when there were no answers. Investigators continued to follow leads, but they were few and far between. Tips came in from people who claimed to have seen Leah in various places, Oregon, California, Canada, but none of them panned out. Psychics contacted the family, offering their services. Theories proliferated online, ranging from the plausible to the outlandish. But Leah Roberts remained missing, and the question that haunted everyone who looked into the case was the same. What happened on that road? In the months following Leah's disappearance, investigators began to explore connections that seemed, at first, tenuous. But in cases like this, where physical evidence is scarce and witnesses are non-existent, even the smallest detail can become significant. One of the more persistent questions involved the name written on the Jeep's window. Tanya. It was a name that meant nothing to Leah's family or known friends. Investigators ran it through databases, checked for any Tonyas in Leah's past, and came up empty. But the fact that it had been written at all suggested intention. Someone had taken the time to leave a message. Whether it was Leah or someone else remained unclear. Some theorized that the name was a reference to something personal, perhaps a nickname or an inside joke that no one outside Leah's immediate circle would understand. Others believed it might have been a message meant for someone specific, a signal that only made sense to the person it was intended for. And then there were those who thought it was a misdirection, a deliberate attempt to confuse anyone who found the vehicle. What made the detail even more unsettling was its placement. It had been written on the rear window, facing outward, as if meant to be seen by someone approaching the Jeep from behind. That positioning suggested awareness, a sense that whoever wrote it knew the vehicle would be found and wanted to leave something behind. But investigators had no way to determine when it had been written. The condensation or dust that formed the letters could have appeared hours or days after the crash, depending on the weather. And without knowing when, they couldn't know who. As the investigation expanded, detectives began looking into Leah's psychological state more closely. They spoke with her therapist, who confirmed that Leah had been struggling with depression in the months following her father's death. She had talked about feeling disconnected from her life, about wanting to escape. But the therapist also noted that Leah had never expressed suicidal thoughts. She was grieving, yes, she was lost, but she wasn't without hope. Still, the entries in Leah's journal painted a picture of someone in deep emotional pain. She wrote about feeling like a ghost in her own life, about moving through days without really being present, about the sense that she was watching herself from a distance, unable to connect with the person she saw. In one entry, dated just days before she left Durham, she wrote, "I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know if I ever did. Maybe if I go far enough, I'll find out. Or maybe I'll just disappear. The words were haunting. They suggested someone on the edge of something, though it wasn't clear what. Was it a breakdown? A desire to start over? Or something darker? Investigators also looked into the possibility that Leah had been meeting someone. Her final phone call, placed from Bellingham, had been to her sister, but there were other calls on her phone records, brief and unexplained, made in the days leading up to her disappearance. The numbers belonged to payphones, gas stations, and rest stops along her route. None of them led anywhere conclusive. One theory that gained traction was that Leah had been planning to meet someone in the Cascades, that she had arranged to rendezvous with a person she knew, or perhaps someone she had met on the road. The remote location of the crash site seemed to support this. Highway 20 was not a major thoroughfare. It was a winding, isolated road that saw relatively little traffic, especially in early spring. If someone wanted to meet in a place where they wouldn't be seen, the North Cascades would have been an ideal choice. But again, there was no evidence of another person. No witnesses reported seeing Leah with anyone. No one came forward to say they had been waiting for her or had plans to meet her. The theory remained just that, a theory. As the first year without answers passed, Leah's case began to attract attention from amateur investigators and online communities dedicated to unsolved disappearances. People pored over the details, debating the significance of the missing battery, the staged appearance of the crash, and the cryptic message on the window. Some believed Leah had orchestrated her own disappearance. Others were convinced she had been the victim of foul play. One of the more widely discussed scenarios involved the possibility that Leah had been followed. Several people noted that in the weeks before her disappearance, Leah had mentioned to friends that she felt like she was being watched. She had described a sense of unease, a feeling that someone was paying too much attention to her. At the time, her friends had assumed it was paranoia, a side effect of grief and isolation. But in hindsight, some wondered if there had been more to it. Could someone have been tracking her movements? Could she have picked up a stalker somewhere along her route? The idea wasn't without precedent. Young women traveling alone were vulnerable, and the highways of the Pacific Northwest had seen their share of predators over the years. But there was no evidence of stalking. No one suspicious had been reported near her in Bellingham. No strange vehicles had been seen following her Jeep, and the crash site itself showed no signs of a confrontation. Another angle investigators explored involved the possibility of voluntary disappearance. In the months before Leah left Durham, she had spoken frequently about wanting to start over. She had researched how to live off the grid, how to travel without leaving a trace, how to become someone new. Her bank withdrawal, the cash she carried, the vague nature of her travel plans, all of it could have been preparation for vanishing. In this scenario, the crash would have been staged to make it appear that she had been killed or abducted, throwing off anyone who might come looking for her. The missing battery and license plates would have been her attempt to make the Jeep unusable and untraceable. And the message on the window could have been a final, cryptic goodbye, or a red herring meant to mislead. But those who knew Leah struggled with this explanation. Yes, she had been unhappy. Yes, she had wanted change. But would she really have put her family through the agony of not knowing? Would she have let her sister believe she was dead? Some argued that grief could push a person to extremes, that Leah might have believed disappearing was the only way to escape the pain she was carrying. Others countered that Leah, despite her struggles, had always been considerate of those she loved. She wouldn't have vanished without a word. By the second year, the active investigation had slowed. Leads had dried up. The case remained open, but it was no longer a priority. Leah's family continued to search, posting updates online, reaching out to media outlets, keeping her face in front of the public. They hired private investigators. They offered rewards. They refused to give up. But as time passed, the likelihood of finding Leah alive grew smaller. The wilderness where her Jeep had been found was vast and unforgiving. If she had been injured in the crash and wandered off, she wouldn't have survived long. If she had been taken by someone, the trail had gone cold years ago. And if she had disappeared by choice, she had done so without leaving a single trace. More than 2 decades have passed since Leah Roberts drove away from Bellingham and into the mountains. In that time, her case has been examined and re-examined by law enforcement, private investigators, journalists, and countless members of the public. It has been featured in documentaries, podcasts, and online forums. It has inspired theories, speculation, and debate. But for all the attention, the central question remains unanswered. What happened to Leah Roberts? Over the years, new information has surfaced, though none of it has brought definitive closure. In 2002, a hiker discovered a human bone fragment in the area near where Leah's Jeep was found. DNA testing was inconclusive. The fragment was too degraded to provide a match. It remains unknown whether it belonged to Leah or someone else entirely. In 2005, a woman in Oregon reported seeing someone who matched Leah's description working at a bookstore. Investigators followed up, but the lead went nowhere. The woman in question was not Leah. In 2010, Leah's case was reopened as part of a cold case initiative. New investigators reviewed the evidence, interviewed old witnesses, and re-examined the crash site using updated forensic techniques. They concluded what their predecessors had. The crash appeared to have been staged, the circumstances were highly unusual, and there was no clear indication of what had happened to Leah after the vehicle went off the road. In 2018, advancements in DNA technology led to a renewed push to identify the bone fragment found years earlier. The results were inconclusive. The fragment could not be definitively linked to Leah, but it also could not be ruled out. Leah's sister has never stopped searching. In interviews over the years, she has spoken about the impossibility of grief without closure. She has described the experience of losing someone twice, once to their physical absence, and again to the absence of answers. She has kept Leah's memory alive, maintaining a website dedicated to her case, sharing updates, and advocating for other families of the missing. In one interview, she said, "People ask me if I think she's still alive. I don't know how to answer that. Part of me wants to believe she is, that she's out there somewhere, living a life she chose, free from the pain she was carrying. But another part of me knows that if she were alive, she would have reached out by now. She wouldn't let me wonder forever." The question of intent, whether Leah left by choice or was taken against her will, has never been resolved. Those who believe she disappeared voluntarily point to her journal, her withdrawal of cash, and her expressed desire to start over. Those who believe she met with foul play point to the staged crash, the missing components, and the cryptic message on the window. Both theories have their merits. Both have their weaknesses. The case has also prompted broader conversations about the vulnerabilities faced by young people traveling alone, particularly women. Leah's story is not unique. Every year, thousands of people go missing in the United States, many of them under circumstances that are never fully explained. Some are victims of violence. Some are running from something. Some simply lose their way. Leah's disappearance highlights the fragility of the systems meant to protect people like her. She had been grieving, isolated, and emotionally fragile. She had spoken about feeling lost. And yet, when she drove away from Bellingham that day, no one could have known what would happen next. Would things have been different if she had traveled with someone? If she had stayed in closer contact with her family? If she had sought more support during her time of grief? These are questions without answers. They are the kinds of questions that survivors ask themselves over and over, searching for the moment where intervention might have changed the outcome. In the years since Leah's disappearance, her case has become emblematic of a particular kind of mystery, the kind where all the pieces are present, but the picture they form remains unclear. It is a case defined not by what is known, but by what is not, by absence, by silence, by the unsettling realization that someone can simply vanish, leaving behind only fragments and questions. The Jeep, recovered from the embankment, was eventually returned to Leah's family. It sits now in storage, a physical reminder of the last known moments of her journey. The journal, the maps, the camping gear, all of it preserved as evidence in a case that may never be solved. Leah's belongings have become artifacts of a life interrupted. They tell a story, but not the whole story. They hint at intention without revealing outcome. They are the remnants of a person who was here, and then was not. What happened on Highway 20 in March of 2000 may never be fully understood. Whether Leah Roberts walked away from that crash, or whether she was taken, or whether something else entirely occurred, these possibilities remain open. The investigation continues, officially, though it has been years since any significant developments emerged. For those who knew Leah, the absence of answers is its own kind of presence. It shapes their lives in ways that are difficult to articulate. It is a weight that never fully lifts. And for the rest of us, Leah's story serves as a reminder of how fragile the line is between presence and absence, how quickly a person can step out of view, how vast the spaces are where people can be lost. The North Cascades remain. The road winds on through the mountains, quiet and indifferent. And somewhere, in the space between what is known and what is feared, Leah Roberts lingers. Not quite gone, never quite found. The question remains, and perhaps it always will. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe, so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Movement for the Restoration of the Ten Commandments. In March of the year 2000, police in southwestern Uganda received reports of a fire at a church compound in the remote village of Kanungu. When they arrived, they found something that would challenge their understanding of what had occurred. The building's windows and doors had been sealed from the outside. Inside, the remains of more than 500 people. What investigators discovered in the days that followed would reveal a story that had been unfolding quietly for more than a decade. It was a story about faith and prophecy, about community and isolation, about the fragile line between devotion and something far more troubling. And at its center was a man named Joseph Kibwetir, a former schoolteacher who had once been trusted and admired in his community. This is the story of the movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God. To understand what happened in Kanungu, you must first understand the Uganda in which Joseph Kibwetir came of age. He was born in 1932 in Kishiriro, in the Ntungamo district of southwestern Uganda, into a devoutly Catholic family. The region was deeply religious, shaped by decades of missionary influence. Young Joseph attended Catholic schools, first at Kayamate Elementary, then at Mbarara High School, and finally at Nter School. Those who knew him in his youth remembered him as intelligent, social, and capable. He made friends easily. He seemed destined for a respectable life. In 1955, Kibwetir graduated from St. George's Teacher Training College in Abanda and began working as a primary school teacher. By 1957, he had become a head teacher. He married, raised a family, and established himself as a pillar of his community. He was active in the Catholic Church, respected by parents and colleagues alike. In 1980, he even ran for political office, though he was not successful. He had enough resources to donate land for a Catholic school he himself founded, one that followed Orthodox teachings and earned a positive reputation in the area. But beneath this stability, Uganda was experiencing profound upheaval. The years following Uganda's independence in 1962 had been marked by violence and instability. Idi Amin's brutal military dictatorship from 1971 to 1979 resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths. When Amin was overthrown, Milton Obote returned to power in a contested 1980 election, and the violence continued. By 1981, Yoweri Museveni had launched a guerrilla war against Obote's government, plunging the country into further conflict. The period between 1981 and 1985 saw mass killings, particularly in the Luuro Triangle region of central Uganda, where government forces committed widespread atrocities against civilians. When Museveni finally seized power in 1986, Uganda had endured nearly 2 decades of political chaos and human rights abuses. Entire communities had been displaced. Families had been torn apart. The social fabric had been shredded. In this environment, many Ugandans turned to religion for solace and meaning. The 1980s saw a proliferation of religious movements, particularly those emphasizing miraculous visions and divine intervention. Marian apparitions, sightings of the Virgin Mary, became increasingly common, offering hope to people who had witnessed so much suffering. It was during this period that Joseph Kibwetere's life took a different turn. In 1984, he claimed to have experienced visions of the Virgin Mary. He was not alone in this. The broader religious landscape of Uganda in the 1980s was fertile ground for such experiences. What made Kibwetere's case noteworthy was what came next. The vision, he later said, had been brought to him by a woman named Credonia Mwerend. Mwerend was born on July 30, 1952, in Bugarama village in Tungamo district. Her family had later relocated to Katat village outside Kanungu, participating in a government resettlement program. Her father, Paul Kashaku, was a farmer of modest means. Various accounts describe Credonia's early life differently. Some sources claim she worked as a shopkeeper and brewer of banana beer. Others, including some official accounts, describe her as having worked as a prostitute. Whether this characterization was accurate or whether it was invented, perhaps by Kibwetere himself to create a parallel with Mary Magdalene, or by critics seeking to discredit the movement, remains unclear. What is certain is that Credonia Mwerend claimed to receive messages from the Virgin Mary. She said these messages came through visions and, later, through a hidden telephone system that could supposedly communicate through everyday objects. Her father, Paul Kashaku, also reportedly experienced visions and predicted that the world would end before the year 2000. In 1989, Mwerend, along with two other individuals, approached Joseph Kibwetere. She told him that the Virgin Mary had instructed her to seek him out. Kibwetere was reportedly struck by Mwerend's account of a Marian apparition near his own home, which seemed to align with his own vision from 5 years earlier. Together, Kibwetere and Mwerend founded the movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God. The stated mission was straightforward: to follow the 10 Commandments strictly and to prepare for the end of the world, which they believed was imminent. The apocalypse, they taught, would arrive with the new millennium, and only those who adhered to their teachings would be saved. The movement initially operated from Kibwetere's property in Rwashamere. Members lived communally, pooling their resources and following a rigid daily schedule. They woke at midnight for prayers, worked in the fields, attended more prayer sessions, and observed strict rules. Alcohol, cigarettes, soap, and sexual relations were forbidden. To avoid breaking the 8th commandment, "Thou shalt not bear false witness," speaking was discouraged. Members communicated primarily through hand signals. The group emphasized the Virgin Mary as instrumental in their salvation. They recruited an equal number of women as men, reflecting this devotion to Mother Mary. The movement registered as a religious NGO in 1997, which gave it official permission to operate throughout Uganda. It established recruitment centers, built a primary school, and opened shops in Kanungu and Katojo. To join, prospective members paid fees: 5,000 Ugandan shillings for children, 8,000 for youths, and 25,000 for adults. More significantly, many members were required to sell their property and possessions, turning over all proceeds to the movement's leadership. The group attracted followers from various backgrounds, though it drew heavily from the Catholic Church. Women, children, and some middle-aged men joined, often people who had experienced trauma during Uganda's years of conflict. A psychological study conducted years later found that 25% of those who died in the 2000 events had been in poor physical health, and 3% had been living with HIV. Many had been traumatized by armed conflict. The movement offered them structure, community, and the promise of salvation. But the movement also attracted scrutiny. In October 1993, villagers in Rwashamere grew suspicious of the group's unusual lifestyle and forced them to leave. The movement relocated to Kanungu, settling on 10 acres of land donated by Credonia Mwerend's father, Paul Kashaku. They built their new compound on this property. Some accounts state that the church they constructed stood directly over Kashaku's grave. The group gained legitimacy when Dominic Catarababo, a respected Catholic priest with a PhD from a university in the United States, joined the movement. Catarababo had been excommunicated from the Catholic Church, but his education and prior standing lent credibility to Kibwetir and Mweren's claims. Other defrocked priests and nuns also joined, serving as theologians who rationalized the messages coming from the leadership. Despite these additions, questions remained about the true power structure within the movement. While Joseph Kibwetir was the public face, the figurehead who gave the movement masculine authority and enhanced its public image, several former members later claimed that Credonia Mwerend was the true leader. One former sect member, Paul Ikazir, who eventually returned to the Catholic Church, stated that meetings were chaired by Mwerend and that she was the de facto head of the group. Kibwetir's family would later corroborate this. After the events of 2000, a family member stated that Kibwetir's actions had been entirely influenced by Credonia Mwerend. By the late 1990s, the movement had grown substantially. Estimates placed membership between 5,000 and 6,000 at its height. The compound in Kanungu had developed into a thriving community, set among pineapple and banana plantations. Members lived and worked together, awaiting the apocalypse they had been promised. The year 2000, they were told, would not follow in the ordinary sequence of years. Instead, after December 31st, 1999, would come year one of the new world. Everything else would end. As the calendar approached the year 2000, activity within the movement intensified. Leaders urged members to confess their sins in preparation for the end. Work in the fields ceased. Clothes and cattle were sold cheaply. Former members who had left the group were re-recruited, called back for what was promised to be their final salvation. The atmosphere grew frenzied, charged with anticipation. Joseph Kibwetir and Credonia Mwerend had set multiple dates for the apocalypse over the years, and each had passed without incident. But this time felt different. The millennium, a symbolic threshold recognized around the world, gave their prophecy a certain weight. Members believed this would be the final reckoning. As 1999 drew to a close, the movement prepared. Members had already surrendered their possessions, their savings, their connections to the outside world. Many had cut ties with family members who did not believe, isolating themselves completely within the compound. Some had been beaten for minor infractions, like using soap, which Mwerend forbade. The group had created what observers would later describe as a propertyless and helpless society, one in which followers became entirely dependent on the leadership and had nothing to fall back on. Then January 1st, 2000 arrived, and the world did not end. The sun rose. The day passed like any other. There was no apocalypse, no divine intervention, no transformation into a new world. The prophecy had failed. In the aftermath, something shifted within the movement. Questions emerged. Doubt spread. The strict rule of silence, which had governed daily life for years, began to break down. Members started talking among themselves, asking what had gone wrong. Some demanded explanations from Kibwetir and Mwerend. Others, more directly, began asking for the return of their money and property. Ugandan police would later theorize that this internal crisis represented a significant threat to the leadership. Members who had sacrificed everything based on a prophecy that had not come true were rebelling. Payments to the church decreased dramatically. The carefully constructed order was unraveling. In response, the leadership announced a new date. The apocalypse, they said, would now occur on March 17, 2000. The Virgin Mary had appeared again, they claimed, and had extended the timeline. This time, they promised, the end would come with ceremony and finality. In early March, the movement began unusual preparations. They started slaughtering cattle and purchasing massive quantities of Coca-Cola. Reports indicate they bought 70 crates of soft drinks. On March 16th, they held a large feast. 3 bulls were roasted. Members from other camps across the region were brought to the Kanungu compound for what was described as a final celebration, a last supper before ascension. At the time, neighbors did not fully understand what was happening. The feast seemed strange but not necessarily alarming. The movement had always been unconventional. A few days before March 17th, Dominic Catarababo was seen purchasing 50 liters of sulfuric acid. The reason for this purchase was not immediately clear. On the morning of March 17th, members gathered at the church building in Kanungu, the structure built over Paul Kashaku's grave. They had been told that they would be locked inside the building for their protection and that the Virgin Mary would come personally, clothed in flames, to take them to heaven. The message was clear. Only those inside would be delivered. Approximately 530 people entered the building that morning. Then the windows and doors were boarded shut from the outside. Nails were driven into the wood, sealing every exit. Minutes after the members had gathered inside, villagers nearby heard an explosion. The building erupted in flames, an intense, consuming fire. Those inside had no way to escape. Only one person survived. A 17-year-old boy named Peter Ahimbasabu had left earlier to buy food and was not inside when the fire started. Everyone else perished. The inferno was so intense that initial responders could barely comprehend what they were seeing. The police were called. When they arrived, they found the charred remains of hundreds of people. The heat had been so extreme that many bodies were burned beyond recognition. At first, authorities believed they were looking at a mass suicide. The initial assumption was that the members of the movement, devastated by the failure of their prophecy, had chosen to end their lives together in a final act of devotion. But 4 days later, police began investigating other properties associated with the movement. What they found changed everything. At the Kanungu compound, 6 bodies were discovered sealed in a latrine. At a compound in Bunage, investigators uncovered 153 bodies in mass graves. At Dominic Catarababo's estate in Ragazzi, they found 155 more bodies, many showing signs of having been poisoned and stabbed. At Joseph Nimirinda's farm, another 81 bodies lay buried. Medical examiners determined that the majority of these individuals had been poisoned. Some had banana fibers twisted around their necks, initially leading investigators to believe they had been strangled, though this was later disputed. Forensic analysis indicated that many of these deaths had occurred weeks, possibly months, before the church fire on March 17th. The picture that emerged was not one of mass suicide but of systematic murder. The official death toll eventually settled at 924 people, though some estimates placed the number even higher, possibly exceeding 1,000. The Kanungu massacre, as it came to be known, surpassed the 1978 Jonestown tragedy in Guyana, where 918 people died, making it one of the largest cult-related killings in recorded history. But even as the scale of the tragedy became clear, critical questions remained unanswered. Where were the leaders? In the immediate aftermath of the fire, authorities assumed that Joseph Kibwetir, Credonia Mwerend, and the other primary leaders, Joseph Kasaparari, John Kamagara, and Dominic Catarababo, had perished in the flames along with their followers. But as the investigation progressed, that assumption began to seem less certain. Ugandan police concluded that the leadership, particularly Mwerend, had likely orchestrated the deaths in response to the crisis that erupted after the failed January 1st prophecy. They believed the leaders had begun a systematic purge of their followers, eliminating those who questioned them or demanded the return of their property. Evidence suggested that Credonia Mwerend had left the Kanungu compound in the early hours of March 17th, before the fire. Witnesses reported seeing a vehicle arrive at the compound that morning. Some accounts claimed that Mwerend's nephew later stated his aunt had been picked up by a car and taken to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He noted that she had left behind her land title with the police, as if expecting to return one day. Joseph Kibwetir's fate was even more uncertain. His family members gave conflicting accounts. Some believed he had died in the fire. Others were not so sure. One relative mentioned that Kibwetir had been seen shortly before the events, being supported by 2 cult members on a bus, appearing physically weak and being moved between camps. Years later, researchers from Makerere University conducted a psychological study of the cult and interviewed surviving family members and former members. Professor Eugene Kinyanda, one of the researchers, reported that Kibwetir's wife had described him as extremely weak in his final months, possibly suffering from diabetes. The research suggested that Kibwetir might have died in 1998 or thereabouts, possibly from diabetes or complications related to bipolar disorder, which he had reportedly been treated for a year before the massacre. If this account is accurate, it would mean that Kibwetir, the public face of the movement, was not even present for the final tragedy. But official records tell a different story. The Ugandan police issued international arrest warrants for all 5 principal leaders in April 2000, treating them as fugitives rather than victims. Kibwetir, Mwerinde, Kasaparari, Kamagara, and Katarababo were wanted in connection with mass murder. In 2014, the Ugandan National Police announced that they had received reports suggesting Joseph Kibwetir was hiding in Malawi. Whether these reports had any basis in fact or were simply echoes of a story that refused to end cleanly remains unknown. Professor Kinyanda's research offered a different theory regarding some of the other leaders. He suggested that Dominic Katarababo had likely died in the Inferno, based on police reports that a body found in the fire had been wearing a priest's dog collar. As for Credonia Mwerinde, Kinyanda believed she probably died in the fire as well, though he acknowledged uncertainty. Scholar Richard Vokes, who wrote a book titled Ghosts of Kanungu after conducting his own investigation in 2009, argued that it was simply impossible to know whether Mwerinde and the other leaders had died in the fire or had orchestrated the mass suicide before escaping. He noted that much of the witness testimony suggesting the leaders had survived was unreliable, based on his own interviews with those witnesses. The forensic evidence itself was compromised. The investigation was marked by poor methodology and corruption, according to Vokes and other observers. Bodies were not properly identified. Sites were not secured. The intense heat of the fire made identification nearly impossible in many cases. Even determining an exact death toll proved difficult. Adding to the confusion were the broader questions about what had actually happened. Was this a mass murder, as police concluded, or a mass suicide in which leaders manipulated followers into ending their lives? Or was it some combination of both? The Uganda Human Rights Commission launched a formal inquiry and released a report in May 2002 titled The Kanungu Massacre, the Movement for the Restoration of the Ten Commandments of God Indicted. The report concluded that the events had been orchestrated by the leadership. It described a pattern of exploitation, manipulation, and eventual violence. But even this official account left gaps. A Ugandan source noted in 2007 that no one can really explain the whys, hows, what's, where, when. By 2024, no one had been prosecuted in connection with the massacre. The 5 leaders remained, officially, at large. The 48-acre plot of land where the church once stood has since been incorporated into a tea plantation. The owner has announced plans to create a memorial on parts of the property, though as of this writing, that memorial has not been completed. In the years following the tragedy, the Ugandan government expressed profound shock at the scale of the deaths. President Yoweri Museveni publicly denounced the cult leaders as murderers and ordered a full investigation. Parliamentary committees reviewed what had gone wrong, noting that warning signs had been raised as early as February 2000, less than a month before the fire, by concerned citizens. Those warnings had been ignored. The massacre heightened public awareness in Uganda about the dangers posed by apocalyptic sects and unregistered religious movements. It fostered widespread skepticism toward fringe groups that exploited vulnerable populations. But it also raised uncomfortable questions about how such a movement could have operated for more than a decade, accumulating thousands of followers, without triggering earlier intervention. Education authorities had closed down the movement school due to poor sanitation, low academic standards, and violations of children's rights. Neighbors had reported strange activities. Yet the movement continued, registered as an official NGO, permitted to operate throughout the country. How had this happened? To understand the movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God, you must consider not just the actions of its leaders, but the conditions that made such a movement possible. Uganda in the 1980s and 1990s was a nation recovering from decades of trauma. The violence of the Amin years, the brutality of Obote's second regime, the 5-year guerrilla war that brought Museveni to power, all of this had left deep psychological scars. Communities had been displaced, families destroyed, social structures shattered. In this environment, many sought meaning and stability wherever they could find it. Religious movements offered hope, structure, and the promise of divine protection in a world that had proven unpredictable and dangerous. The movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God was not unique in claiming visions and prophesying the end times. What set it apart was the scale of its ultimate tragedy. Researchers who studied the cult's followers found that many had been traumatized by Uganda's armed conflicts. They were people who had experienced profound loss, who lived with illness, who felt disconnected from the rapidly changing world around them. The movement offered them a community, a sense of purpose, and the assurance that their suffering had meaning. Joseph Kibwetir himself was a product of this environment. He had lived through political upheaval, through Amin's dictatorship, through the violent transition that brought Museveni to power. He had witnessed his country torn apart. Whether his early visions were genuine religious experiences, symptoms of mental illness, he had reportedly been treated for bipolar disorder, or something else entirely is impossible to determine. What is clear is that he found in those visions a new direction, one that led him away from his respected position as an educator and into something far darker. Credonia Mwerend remains perhaps the most enigmatic figure in the entire story. Described variously as a prophet, a manipulator, a true believer, and a fraud, she wielded significant influence over the movement's direction. Former members indicated she was the real power behind the group, chairing meetings and making decisions while Kibwetir served as the public face. Whether she believed in her own visions or consciously deceived her followers is unknowable. Whether she died in the fire or escaped is equally uncertain. The psychological dynamics of the movement followed patterns seen in other high-control groups. Isolation from family and outside community. Surrender of personal property and autonomy. Rigid rules governing behavior and communication. Harsh punishments for violations. Constant reinforcement of apocalyptic beliefs. An emphasis on obedience to leadership. These mechanisms created an environment in which questioning became difficult, dissent dangerous, and escape psychologically or practically impossible for many members. When the prophecy failed on January 1, 2000, it created a rupture in this carefully constructed system. Followers who had given up everything based on a specific promise found that promise broken. The cognitive dissonance was acute. Some demanded their property back. Others simply questioned. And in that questioning, the leadership appears to have seen a threat that required elimination. The discovery of bodies that had been buried weeks before the March 17th fire suggests the killings did not begin suddenly. They were gradual, methodical. People who questioned, who rebelled, who demanded answers. They disappeared into latrines, into mass graves at remote compounds. The final conflagration at the church may have been the culmination of a process that had been underway for some time. There is a particular cruelty in the details. The building sealed from the outside. The explosion that trapped people inside. The feast the day before, a final act of normalcy before horror. The promises of salvation, of the Virgin Mary arriving clothed in flames. The children who died, too young to have made any meaningful choice about their fate. A film was produced in Uganda in 2018 to commemorate the tragedy, titled The World is Ending Tomorrow. The 3-hour dramatization, shot in the local Rukiga language, attempted to reconstruct the events and give voice to those who had perished. The film opened with a young man watching news reports of the fire, desperate to learn whether his cousin had survived. It depicted the gradual seduction of followers, the slow tightening of control, the moment when escape became impossible. But no film, no documentary, no investigation can fully answer the central question. Why? Why did Joseph Kibwetir, a respected teacher, abandon his life to follow visions that led to such devastation? Why did Credonia Mwerend, whatever her background, claim divine messages that resulted in the deaths of hundreds? Why did followers continue to believe even as prophecies repeatedly failed? Why did defrocked priests lend their theological expertise to justifying increasingly extreme beliefs? Why did neighbors, authorities, and family members not intervene more forcefully? The answers, perhaps, lie not in individual pathology but in the intersection of trauma, belief, power, and desperation. The movement emerged from a specific historical moment, a specific set of conditions, a specific landscape of suffering. It offered certainty in an uncertain world, salvation in the midst of chaos, and community to those who felt isolated. And it demanded, in return, absolute surrender. The psychological autopsies conducted after the massacre revealed that a significant number of the deceased had been in poor health, living with HIV, or dealing with the aftermath of trauma. These were not foolish people or weak people. They were people searching for something to hold on to, something to believe in a world that had given them little reason to trust. The question of whether the leaders themselves believed or simply exploited remains unresolved. It is possible that Kibwetir and Mwerin genuinely believed in their visions, that they saw themselves as prophets rather than murderers, that they convinced themselves they were offering salvation even as they orchestrated deaths. It is also possible they were calculating from the start, building a mechanism of control for their own purposes. The truth likely lies somewhere more complex than either extreme. What is certain is that 924 people, possibly more, died in March 2000 in a remote district of Uganda. Their deaths were not accidents or acts of God. They were the result of human decisions, human manipulation, human failure. Uganda has not forgotten. Every year, on the anniversary of the fire, there are reminders, commemorations, questions. The mass grave in Nyabigodo stands as a testament to what happened, though few visit. The site itself is remote, isolated, difficult to reach. The ghosts of Kanungu, as Richard Vokes titled his book, linger in the landscape, in the memories of survivors, in the gaps in the official record. For the families of those who died, there has been no justice in the conventional sense. No trials, no convictions, no accountability. The leaders are either dead or vanished. The movement is gone. The property has been absorbed into other uses. What remains is grief, unanswered questions, and the knowledge that something terrible happened that might have been prevented. In the years since, researchers, journalists, and investigators have tried to piece together a complete picture, but the evidence is fragmentary, contradictory, incomplete. Some witnesses are unreliable. Some records are missing. Some bodies were never properly identified. The truth has been obscured by time, by poor investigation, by the chaos of the event itself. We are left with fragments. A teacher who saw visions. A woman who claimed to speak with Mary. A compound in the hills. Prophecy that failed. A feast, a fire, and silence. The movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God stands as one of the darkest chapters in Uganda's modern history. It is a story about what happens when trauma meets prophecy, when isolation meets absolutism, when hope curdles into something unrecognizable. And it is a story without a clean ending, because the central figures disappeared, because the investigation was flawed, because too many questions remain unanswered. What we know is this: in March 2000, hundreds of people died in circumstances that should never have occurred. They died because they believed something that was not true, or because they were trapped by people they trusted, or because they could not escape. They died in fire, in pits, in latrines. They died believing they were going to heaven. Whether Joseph Kibwetir lies among them, or whether he died years earlier, or whether he lived and fled, we do not know. Whether Credonia Mwerend perished in the flames she may have helped ignite, or whether she escaped to live in hiding, we do not know. Whether the other leaders are dead or alive, we do not know. The movement is gone. The compound has been reclaimed. The story has passed into history. But for those who lost family members, for those who survived, for those who must live with the knowledge of what happened, the story is not over. It persists in the empty spaces, in the unanswered questions, in the long shadow cast by those final days. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all, that something so catastrophic, so thoroughly destructive, can end without resolution, without closure, without even the certainty of knowing precisely what occurred or why. The movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God began with visions of salvation. It ended in a church that became a furnace, in graves scattered across southwestern Uganda, in a mystery that has never been fully solved. And somewhere, in the hills of Kanungu, the wind still moves through the tea plantations that now cover the ground where hundreds once believed they would ascend to heaven. The world did not end in the year 2000. But for 924 people in a remote corner of Uganda, everything did. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.